Hi, I'm Lindsay from American Patchwork and Quilting, and this video is brought to you by Baby Lock. If you're finishing a quilt that has curves or scalloped edges, or want to emphasize a fabric's design like a stripe, you may want to use bias binding. Bias binding refers to binding cut diagonally across your fabric. It's also the type of binding that takes the most yardage. But we have a fun trick to share with you today: how to cut one length of bias binding using a single square of fabric. First, you'll need to figure out what size square to cut for your binding. We have a handy download of the math for you in the video description. We're using an 18-inch square for this demonstration, which will give us enough bias binding for a table topper size quilt. So you want to cut your square in half diagonally to form two triangles. You're going to arrange your triangles into a parallelogram. So we'll move one triangle to the opposite side of the other triangle, align those short edges, and sew a 1/4 inch seam along those edges. Once your seam is sewn, you want to press that seam allowance open. Now we're going to use a fabric marker or a pencil and a ruler to draw lines parallel to these long bias edges, the desired width of your binding strip. We're spacing our lines 2.5 inches apart for a 2.5 inch wide binding strip. With the right side of the fabric facing up, you're going to fold each of your corners down. You're going to align the lines you just drew, but offsetting the lines by 1. So you should have these tails right here on both ends. Once you have all your lines aligned, you're going to pin these raw edges in place. Sew the bias edges together with a 1/4 inch seam allowance. Then press the seam allowance open. Begin cutting on the top marked line and cut in a continuous spiral. We're using a scissors here since we have fabric on both sides. You definitely don't want to use a rotary cutter to cut these lines. So just keep rotating your tube and continue cutting through just that one layer of fabric. Once your binding is complete, you'll prep it just like you would your normal binding and sew it to your quilt. One tip: since bias binding is stretchy, avoid pulling it too tightly when you're sewing it to the quilt. Ease it in gently so the fabric can stretch around the curves and lay flat. We hope this tip saves you fabric and gives you success the next time you use bias binding to finish a quilt.